Turn now to education and the quality of the schools our children attend. How do we know? The current measure, decile ratings, have conflated schools with socio-economic positions of their communities to such a great extent that really good schools have suffered from student flight, and underperforming schools at the other end of the decile system have sometimes managed to get away with not being as good as they could be or should be. The government's response to this is the equity index, greater accuracy, better targeting, less blunt stigma. They're the intentions. But that's still a year away at least. In the meantime, the New Zealand Initiative has another idea, and they're describing it as groundbreaking. Now, this is a pro-free market think tank that arose out of the Business Roundtable and the New Zealand Institute. But the idea that schools with merit aren't stigmatised for the lack of wealth in their communities echoes the government's own reason for dumping deciles. So we wanted to hear more about it. Joining us from Wellington to spell out how it works and why it should be adopted is New Zealand Initiative Chief Economist Eric Crampton. Eric, it's so good to have you with us. Thanks for coming in. And here with us in our studio in Auckland, we have Robin Staples, Principal of the Decile 1 Southern Cross Campus in Mangere East. Thank you so much for being here. You know, Robin, the moment I named your school, Southern Cross Campus, I said Decile 1, right? And so I stigmatise your school by the socio-economic status of its community, right? But what I know from this report is your school is doing phenomenal work, and in fact your UE pass rate puts you in the top 25% of schools in the country.
Well, that's right. We've been really working hard to make an improvement for our young people, particularly in Year 13, because their future education is based on what they leave our school with, and we know that they're going on to really good things, and it's frustrating to be continually prepared to decile 1.
In fact, it's 1B, isn't it? Is that right?
Oh, 1B, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so people say you're decile, and parents who can do flight suddenly think I'm going to send my kids somewhere else, right? In fact, what this report, which you agreed for your school to be part of, suggests is that you're offering you're punching above your weight.
Well, absolutely, and we've actually, I think, listened to research, and we've found that by culturally engaging our kids and with a lot of hard work from our teachers and leadership, we're actually making that difference. And the UE access rate for us, for our kids, is very important, and this year we've made a big stride to improve on that.
So tell me about it. So what's your rate?
Well, we're getting near to 30%. Now, still that is low relative to a lot of others, but we'd like to go more, and we'd like to find out what are the things we're doing well and compare with other schools and then learn from them.
Okay, I'm going to bring Eric Crampton in. Now whack that earpiece into your ear. It's just popped out. I'm going to bring Eric Crampton in so Robin, you can hear Eric. How do we get this right, Eric? So because everyone thinks the deciles have done a really blunt job and have often confused school performance with the socioeconomic position of their communities. What's your response to that?
Oh, you're absolutely correct that it's really easy for a high decile school serving a more privileged community to have students that come out with a lot higher achievement standards. What that ends up doing is punishing low decile schools that are actually really strong performers. A year ago, we'd put out a report showing that on a raw figure, something like 70% of schools in the bottom 2 deciles look to be underperforming. But when you took away all of the things that are outside of that school's control, instead 40% were in the top 20%. So it was a really remarkable difference. And what we think can happen is that the ministry should be able to use the coding that we've done in the Stats Data Lab to produce reports similar to the one that we've produced for Southern Cross Campus for every board of trustees in the country. Wouldn't that make a difference for school governance? Right now, a common characteristic of schools that have a really hard time in improving is that their boards have a hard time keeping a handle on their principals. They need the kind of information that the ministry could provide them at the touch of a button, showing whether their school is doing superbly relative to the cohort it serves, is doing about as well as expected, or doing worse than expected and in need of learning from other schools that are comparable.
Eric, does this undermine funding? So the funding model, once again, is a fairly blunt assessment, isn't it? It's based on decile. If a school is overperforming relative to the expectations and the disadvantage it is working with, does that compromise its funding?
So we've not been looking at funding at all. The government is working on this equity index to change the decile funding system to be a bit less blunt. I think that overall the decile funding system and giving more money to schools serving less privileged communities is an important and under-acknowledged part of our overall redistribution system. What we're looking at here, though, is ways of assessing how well a school is doing so that the principal, the Board of Governors, and the parents can better manage their own schools, find out which ones are doing well, and learn from them.
Robin, I'm going to come back to you, but I just want to pick up on the point that, so I'm just going to pick up on one further point that Eric made. 42 decile 1 and 2 schools outperform 75% of every other secondary school in New Zealand. This is when evaluated in the terms you're looking at it. In contrast, 9 decile 9 and 10 schools were in the bottom 25%. Now, those communities probably have no idea their schools are underperforming to that extent because, once again, high decile ratings obscure that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
Okay. So do you have trouble retaining kids? In other words, kids that have the capacity to leave, whose parents are somehow able to get their children to other schools, take them out? And if so, why? Is it the decile thing that's that impediment for you?
Well, we haven't had trouble retaining kids recently because I think we've improved our reputation in our local community. The thing that bugs us is that we're continually locked into this decile 1 category, and we're high performing, and we'd like to be able to shift that nationally so we'd be able to stand up in our own right in national sense.
So you've participated in this study. Have you read the study? And if so, what do you think of it?
Well, I think it's got great merit. I think there's ways of us being able to be accountable for resourcing, and then if resourcing is having the effect we want, we'd know and we could improve on that. I think that's the whole thing. As a taxpayer, I want to know that the value in education is being delivered. Now, to do that, we need a measure like this, I think, to actually take into account the community aspects we're in and then build on it further.
And in terms of the government's response to it, which we're going to see probably next year, is that adequate? Is that as much as you would hope for?
Well, I don't think it is, because one of the key things is that our staffing is still not decile based, or it's not based in terms of need. And we need to have a measure that enables us to actually increase the resourcing for teaching as well.
So what would you like to see? What would make a difference so that your school was treated with the respect it deserves, not stigmatised by the socioeconomic position of the community it's in, and where merit was rewarded?
Well, that's exactly right. I'd like to see us with the resourcing to make that difference of being able to then sustain it over a longer period of time. What we have often is that the small schools make a bit of a blip for a while, but then they fall back because of the difficulties they've got. What we've got to get is across the nation a strategy that actually builds successfully for all of our schools.
Eric, this is a good time to talk about this because the Ministry's looking at it and the Minister's looking at it, and we all know that Chris Hipkins is highly motivated to make changes. Do you think the changes he's making are sufficient, and what would you recommend that he does as well?
I think that the kind of work we're doing can form the basis for some substantial innovations in the governance of schools. So when a school board or a principal is trying something new, they need a way of telling whether it's working or not. This kind of measure, which lets schools compare themselves to other schools with very similar cohorts, gives a sound basis for telling whether what they're doing is working or not. So instead of focusing a lot on how much money should go to different schools, we could instead be looking at which schools are successful. What are they doing that's different from other schools? Can we try that as a pilot to roll out in some other schools that are similar? Evaluate how that works, and then let the money follow the programs that prove themselves effective rather than just putting it to the schools that have certain characteristics.
Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative. People can read this report. It's up on your website now.
It sure is.
Yeah, thank you. And Robin Staples from Southern Cross, Principal of Southern Cross, thank you for being part of this project. Congratulations on the work you're doing.
Pleasure, thank you.
I know you and the school are proud of how things are going, and I know the kids are really proud of it, right?
Sure are, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. We appreciate it. We're going to have a conversation about getting this right, getting education right over the next few weeks and months on Breakfast leading up to the election. So this is the beginning of an important dialogue. Thank you both.
One of the most important dialogues, isn't it? I mean, Whitney Houston said it. The kids are our future.
Yeah.
The children are our future, she's son.
Yeah, and the notion that we define children by the very blunt instrument of the community, the wealth or otherwise of the community they're from, does them such a radical disservice. So measures that respond to merit and also find need in a more precise and surgical fashion.
It's very difficult to get that right,
yeah,
isn't it?
The New Zealand Initiative is saying they have. We'll talk to the Minister about all of this too in the weeks ahead.